All right, party people, we are back today with a much shorter lesson than the other lessons of Unit 4 have been. Really, today we're just going to look at the use of enlightened ideas by some monarchs, mostly in Central Europe, mostly in Prussia and in Austria, although there is some flirtation with Catherine the Great in Russia as well. And we call them the enlightened despots, which is just another way of saying absolute rulers. So the use of enlightened monarchy in some places. All right, and this covers 4.6 of the course description. In 4.6, what we see is there's really a focus on these enlightened absolute monarchs. And so the first big thing that we need to understand is that the effect of the Enlightenment is going to vary by region. And one of the first things we're going to see is that while in Western Europe, many times there is a contentious relationship between the monarchy and the Enlightenment philosophers. Think of Voltaire and his life of exile because of his criticisms of the French state. In the central part of the state, there is going to be a much more amicable relationship between the monarchy and Enlightenment philosophers. And basically, the key big picture thing we see here is that the monarchs of Prussia and Austria are going to utilize some of the ideas of the Enlightenment to impose greater rationality on their societies, and they are going to be looked to by their people as sort of willing participants in this sort of reform that we see. So we don't get the contentious relationship. This is best exemplified by Immanuel Kant's relationship with Frederick the Great of Prussia. He was sort of the court writer for him. Voltaire also spent a couple of years living with Frederick the Great. And so Frederick the Great sought out Enlightenment philosophers and used the Enlightenment to strengthen his own power. That's the thing here with the enlightened absolute monarchs, is that although they will implement certain ideas of the Enlightenment, ideas such as civic equality, religious toleration, they will resist any attempts to limit their own power. So they will reject the idea of like separation of powers or a constitution that clearly defines what the kings may or may not do. Right, so it's a bit of a mixed bag. How enlightened are the absolute monarchs? That is a question the College Board would probably love to ask. And of course, the question is, or the answer is, well, they were in some ways, and in other ways they weren't, right? That classic yeah, but sort of scenario the College Board likes to do. All right, so I basically covered the first main idea. It's that Central European monarchs are going to implement some of the Enlightenment reforms. The big ones are religious toleration, particularly for Christian minority groups or for Jewish populations, the promotion of rationality. There is, we'll look at this picture tomorrow, but there was a picture I put on a test of Joseph II. He's in the field with a plow. He's wearing his wig, his powdered wig, and he is imposing greater agricultural rationality. Sometimes there was talk about abolition of serfdom. Joseph II, again of Austria, is going to attempt to do this, although he will not be successful. But this is another Enlightenment sort of idea. Get rid of serfdom, motivate the peasants, allow them to own their own land. They'll be incentivized to work harder. You'll produce more food. Society will be more stable. Those are examples of how these monarchs are going to implement those ideas, right? However, like we said, it is limited in some ways as well. They are not going to agree to constitutionalism. They are not going to agree to limited government. They are not going to agree to checks and balances, separation of powers, things like Montesquieu would say, right? Okay. And again, this is mostly in Central Europe, and really it's Prussia and Austria. And that's the second thing we're going to talk about, is the emergence of these two states. There is some flirtation with Enlightenment ideas with Catherine the Great of Russia, although she is far less able to implement those ideas, but she certainly enjoys sponsoring them, having them, corresponding with them. But when the French Revolution breaks out, she's very quick to cut things off. And that is not a pun about the guillotine. Okay, so the other things that we're going to see during this time is the rise of monarchs in Central and Eastern Europe. And Prussia and Austria, obviously, you need to know. And the two absolute monarchs that use Enlightenment ideas that you would probably need to know They're listed in the course description. We talked about them in class. Frederick the Great of Prussia and Joseph II of Austria. They also list Maria Theresa, but I don't think she's as important. I would know those two, Frederick II, Joseph II, Prussia and Austria. Now, the emergence of Prussia and Austria happens during this time period as well. They become major players in European political maneuvering and balance of power and all those sorts of things. And both of these states are really going to rise to prominence after the 30 Years' War. In 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia basically limits the sovereignty of the Holy Roman Emperor. And so the Austrian emperor of the Habsburg family basically decides the German states are a mess, they're fragmented, and we don't have an ability to impose our control over them. And so we're going to focus more on our lands to the east. And the Habsburgs were master strategists at marrying to grow their kingdom. And so we're going to see the Austrian lands in Central and Eastern Europe grow. They're going to come to possess parts of the Balkans, Hungary, Bohemia, those sorts of places. And they emerge as a major power and will until the end of World War I. Prussia is going to rise out of sort of the ashes of the German states after the Treaty of Westphalia as well. And through the maneuvering of monarchs like Frederick the Great and Frederick Wilhelm, who comes before him, they're going to build up the Prussian military. It is going to become one of the most admired militaries in Europe, and it's going to transform Prussia into a major power. Now, Prussia will really emerge as a major power when Frederick the Great seizes Silesia from Austria when Maria Theresa takes over. If you remember, Maria Theresa, her father was worried that a woman wouldn't be accepted as a monarch. He went around and got everyone signing a legal document basically saying that she was the legitimate heir. It was called the Pragmatic Sanction. Well, Prussia takes advantage of this. They get drawn into European affairs like the 7 Years' War, and basically the seizure of Silesia and the promotion of the military is going to make Prussia into a significant state, a very powerful player in Central European politics. Certainly we see this with their participation in the partition of Poland that takes place at this time. All right, that's really it. We have covered Unit 4. The main nuts and bolts of Unit 4 came down to three things, right? The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and everyday life. And a big feature that I saw in the course description was looking at cause and effect. So I thought, heads up, Co, I thought I would go over this with you since we're not spending too much time here. And this is 4.7, Causation in the Age of the Scientific Revolution. So 4.7 and 4.1, they basically talk about the same thing. And so I'm just going to run through those points with you real quickly. So number one, this is going to talk about context. Like if you're writing the essay and you get one of these topics, and here's what you should write about. So if it's the scientific revolution, what is the historical context for the scientific revolution? Well, what I would write about is that the rediscovery of Greek and Roman philosophical and biological and scientific observations, the works of Aristotle and all those other guys, reinvigorates European scholars to think about the world, and they begin to practice observation. And of course, what they notice is that many of the old sources of knowledge doesn't match up with what they're observing. And so that's what ushers in the scientific revolution. So the scientific revolution is kind of tied to the idea of the Renaissance, the rediscovery of Greek and Roman ideas, and the idea that people should think for themselves and do those sorts of things. That's what I would write about for the context. Now, the cause and effect of the scientific revolution is that it is going to change the way in which human beings view the cosmos, the way they view nature, the way they view the human body. And basically, we get this new idea of Newtonian mechanism. The world is orderly and rational. It's predictable. It's written in mathematics. And humans, by using reason and logic and observation and experimentation, empiricism, right, they can come to understand the world better. That's the biggest effect or change of whatever you want. Now, of course, there is continuity. Alchemy and superstitious beliefs are still practiced by some people. Alchemy is practiced by the elite still. Superstitious beliefs and witchcraft are going to be a thing for non-elite peoples. All right, second topic, the Enlightenment. the context for the Enlightenment, if I'm writing an essay that modified DBQ on the Enlightenment, my context is going to talk about the scientific revolution, right? The scientific revolution emphasized reason and rationality. And it said that the world was a rational place. And so Enlightenment philosophers are going to say, the world is a rational place, human society should be as well. We should impose rationality. We should impose reason on human institutions, right? So my context is talking about the scientific revolution. And obviously, I would mention specific scientists, Copernicus or Bacon and his belief in empiricism, or Newton and his whole formulation of like Newtonian mechanism or anything like that. And so that's what the context is in my intro paragraph. Now, the effects or the changes that come about because of the Enlightenment is going to challenge traditional institutions that had never really been challenged before. The challenge of absolute monarchy with ideas about limitation of government power, constitutions, spreading power out, are new challenges that political institutions did not face before. Absolutism, right? Economically, we're going to see mercantilistic and traditional restrictions on economic activity, like the church or like the guild, begin to be attacked by Adam Smith, the physiocrats, promoting more laissez-faire, free market, free enterprise, capitalist, whatever term you want to use, which I don't know if I mentioned this, it's the best form of economics there is. That is going to take place during this time. And then religious toleration is going to argue and challenge established state churches and the idea that government should have a role in dictating the personal beliefs of the citizens, right? So the scientific emphasis on reason or rationality leads to the Enlightenment. That's the context. And then the effect of that is that human institutions, traditional sources of authority, will begin to be challenged. The last thing, everyday life. The context for this would be the commercial revolution. The commercial revolution takes place in the 15 and 1600s. European discovery of the New World, European increasing domination of the global trade network introduces new items into the European economy. It creates more powerful nations. It leads to economic prosperity. It leads to urbanization. It leads to increased food because of New World foods. Also, the scientific revolution leads to more scientific agricultural practices. This is all the context you could talk about. So if the DBQ is like, analyze changes in European life in the 18th century, your context could be the commercial revolution that introduces all these changes, right? And so that's what I would write about for my context. And then the effect of this, or the change that we see, a more urban society, changing dynamics within the family where children are looked at as precious little babies as opposed to, another worker and or mouth to feed. A focus on privacy within the family, a more consumer culture with the more readily available goods and creature comforts and things like that. All these things would be good topics to write about in a change in continuity or cause and effect. All right, so I hope that made sense. I tried to go through, here's what my intro would be with the context, and then here's what my body paragraphs would be, what College Board would want you to focus on. So that's it for Unit 4. Tomorrow, I am going to just kind of pull up some quotes. There's lots of quotes and pictures I have of Enlightenment philosophers and scientists from the scientific revolution. So we'll just do that. And look at those from past tests as sort of a review to think about items that we've talked about. We'll take Friday off, and then on Monday, we'll start looking at Unit 5. Until then, I'm out. Say goodbye, Co.